All right, we are in Matthew chapter 7. Um, Last week, we spent most of our time in verses 1 through 6, and then we had gotten started talking about the section beginning in verse 7, and that's where we'll pick up our discussion tonight. We talked last week about the concept of judgment and righteous judgment versus hypocritical judgment that Jesus talks about in this context. And verses 7 through 11, in many ways, I think are here because they fit in this context because they are they are illustrative of how we ought to be, um, and as they give us a picture of how God treats us. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. Or what man is there among you who, when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, uh, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? Sorry about the unintentional pause in my reading. My computer did something mid sentence and I had to clear my screen. Uh, and so let's tie this into its context, because Jesus concludes this section in verse 12 by saying, "In everything, therefore, treat others the way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets." And so, in many ways, I think verse 12 is the summary statement that ties together verses 1 through 11. You treat others in the matter of judgment the way you would want to be treated. You don't treat them hypocritically. You don't hold them to standards by which you yourselves are unwilling to be judged. You don't pick apart the speck that is in their eye while ignoring the beam that's in your eye. That's not the way you would want to be treated. Don't treat others that way. On the other hand, when you have someone who is genuinely interested in spiritual things, then you offer to them the gospel of the kingdom. If they demonstrate that they are not a dog or a swine, verse 6, but rather they are those who would respect what is holy or value pearls, just as the Father gives to those who seek and ask and knock, so you would do so you would do the same thing. You know what it means to give what is good to your children who seek it. Your heavenly Father offers the gospel of the kingdom. He gives kingdom access to the spiritually minded who are truly pursuing it. The language of verses 7 through 11 is used in other contexts regarding the subject of prayer. But in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, I don't think Jesus is talking about prayer here. If he were talking about prayer, you would expect this language to show up in the middle of chapter 6 when he talks about prayer and offers a model prayer. But he includes it here. And I think in this context, Jesus is talking about asking, seeking, knocking, pursuing that which is spiritual, pursuing the gospel of the kingdom and a relationship with the Lord. And the idea is there that it's not something the Lord's going to force upon you. It's not something that you can be lazy about and just expect that it's going to come your way. But nonetheless, it is a matter of grace. Even though you ask, seek, and knock, it is your Father gives what is good. So, in everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. Does that thread of thought make sense? Does that make sense in how this section ties together? Anybody have any comment or question, complaint, or criticism about that before we move on?
I have a comment on the verse 7. I don't generally write in my Bible, but I wrote the words keep and continue in relation to the ask, seek, and knock. I
Yes,
say it's not a one-time event.
yes. The and there is actually a printed footnote in the New American Standard to that effect. The original the original tense of these verbs. So in the English language we have past and present and future, and there are others, but we generally think in those terms: something that has happened, something that is happening, or something that will happen. The Greek language is much more complicated in its verb tenses. um, and I know just enough about this to be incredibly dangerous. But my understanding is that these verbs, ask, seek, and knock, are in what would be called the imperfect present. And the idea is imperfect, in as far as tenses go, simply means incomplete, something that is currently happening but also ongoing. Keep asking, keep seeking, keep knocking, continue these things. Yes, do them now, but this is an ongoing process. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Alan, because the pursuit of genuine biblical spirituality, the pursuit of godliness, the pursuit of the kingdom, the pursuit of righteousness is exactly that. It's a pursuit, it's an ongoing thing. To use Peter's words, to Christians, grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord. Um, it's not a stagnant thing. It's not something where we can say, yes, I've arrived. I can check that off my list and I'm forevermore done. My ticket is punched. That's not at all what is being described in this passage, or for that matter, any other. Anything else you want to say about that, Alan?
No, thank you.
Okay. Did everyone follow that to make sense what we're saying about the words there? All right. Any other questions or comments on verses 7 through 12? Okay. Verse 13 begins what, in my simple outline of the Sermon on the Mount, is the last section of the sermon. So, and just for the benefit of those who haven't been a part of this study all along, the sermon opens with the Beatitudes, and I call that section, beginning in Matthew chapter 5 and uh, and really all the way down through verse 19, for the sake of simplicity, I call that the character. Jesus is describing the character of a kingdom citizen. And then, beginning in verse 20 through the end of chapter 5, Jesus expounds upon that by way of contrast. That's what I call that section. Jesus says, you know, your righteousness needs to surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees. You've heard that it was said, but I say to you. There is this contrast. He teaches by way of contrast. Beginning in chapter 6, verse 1, through Matthew 7, verse 12, Jesus is just prescribing conduct. He's not drawing contrast in the way that he had in the previous section, but he is just saying this is what a kingdom citizen does and does not do. And then the fourth and final section, beginning in Matthew 7, verse 13, Jesus issues a call. It is a call to respond to what Jesus has been teaching. And so there are 4 C's to the Sermon on the Mount: character, contrast, conduct, and now call. Again, that is 100% original with me. Do not blame anybody else for that. Okay. That is just Jeremy's simple way to outline the Sermon on the Mount, and it is worth exactly what it cost you to log into Zoom tonight. It is worth exactly 0. You're welcome to forget that. But there is a shift here with Matthew 7 and verse 13. When Jesus says, enter. So there is a call for response to the gospel of the kingdom. All right. Kathy, will you read verses 13 and 14 for us, please?
Sure. Verse 13, enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it.
All right, thank you. So the invitation is to enter the strait or narrow gate, and to walk the narrow, or as other translations say, the difficult way. That's the invitation that Jesus extends here. That's the call that he makes. There is another option. Again, the kingdom is not something that is going to be forced upon you. A life of godliness, a life of righteousness is not something that God is going to compel you. He is not going to save you against your will. There are those who will teach that. There are those who teach, we've talked a little bit about this in recent Sunday nights, where that the idea is that if God has predetermined that you're going to be one of his saved people, he's going to save you whether you want to be saved or not. I mean, there's just nothing that could be further from what this passage teaches. Jesus says, enter. You have the choice whether or not to enter. Most are going to choose the other gate because it's broad and its path is wide or easy. That's where the majority are going to go. And that's their choice. But Jesus calls on us to make an informed choice. We're not just taking a shot in the dark. We're not just blindly making a decision here. We are making a choice based upon the information that Jesus provides. We can either choose the way that leads to life, or we can choose the way that leads to destruction. Jesus here warns about making decisions purely based upon appearances. We have an expression in our culture: don't judge a book, what?
By its cover.
By its cover. Don't make a decision just based upon the way things look. Most of the time, we apply that to how we evaluate people. And that's a good application, and that's certain. There's certainly biblical precedent to go along with that. But we need to be careful that we don't make life choices based purely upon the present circumstances, the present advantage. That's what the majority are going to do. It is easier to walk through the wide gate and travel the broad road. That's the present advantage. That requires less, that gives you more freedom to do what you want, that expends less energy and gives you that energy to do other things. However you want to expand upon Jesus metaphor, you can do that. But that's the present advantage. Jesus says that the spiritually minded person, the godly person, the person who's going to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, looks at things from the opposite perspective. As was it Zig Ziglar or Stephen Covey, one of these famous leadership gurus, one of the I think it's Stephen Covey, one of his 7 habits of highly effective people is begin with the end in mind. You decide where you want to go. You decide what you want the end to be, what you want to accomplish. And then you work backwards from that to make your decisions. That's what Jesus is saying we ought to do from a spiritual perspective. Is this going to help me get to heaven or not? That's the question. All right. So he warns then, beginning in verse 15, about false prophets. He warns about those who would hinder making the right decisions and accomplishing the right ends. So, Brian, will you read Matthew 7:15 through 20 for us, please?
Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them.
Now, not to back up and rehash our discussion from last week about the beginning of Matthew chapter 7 and the subject of judgment, we made the point last week that Matthew 7, despite how it is often misrepresented, misconstrued, is not an absolute prohibition against all judgment. That's borne out by the context. And that is also borne out by this section beginning in Matthew 7, verse 15. What Jesus calls on us to do is to make a judgment, to look, to examine the fruit and make a decision about whether or not we're dealing with a good tree or a bad tree, whether or not we're dealing with a false prophet or not. Are we dealing with someone who is teaching truth and thus going to help us along the path that leads to heaven? Or are we dealing with someone who's going to lead us down the path toward destruction? Jesus says you've got to be able to make that evaluation. You have to be able to make that determination and judgment. The welfare of your soul depends on it. How do I do that if it's a sin to make any and every judgment? Do you see how that just doesn't compute? And so when I'm talking to someone about Matthew 7, verse 1, when they want to, when I speak against their sin and they want to say, well, Jesus said, don't judge. Well, I'm not going to go anywhere and everywhere across the Bible to talk to them about that subject. I'm just going to say, well, actually, Just look at the verses that immediately follow it. Context, context, context. I mean, I know we say that a lot, but that's so vitally important. Jesus calls on us to make a judgment. And it's not because Jesus delights in the condemnation of false prophets. He's speaking here as by way of self-preservation. This is what you have to do if you're going to enter by the narrow gate and walk the difficult way that leads to life. You've got to beware of those that would compromise your spiritual well-being. And so, on that theme, he continues, beginning in verse 21. Daniel, would you read for us Matthew 7:21 through 23 tonight?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay, good. You are actually there. I didn't know if you just logged in so we could see your name. Make us think you were there. I'm just teasing you. Yeah, if you will, Matthew 7:21 through 23, please.
Okay. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.
So in verses 15 through 20, Jesus warns about being deceived by others. And in verses 21 through 23, Jesus warns about being deceived by ourselves. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord. Jesus here is not talking about the irreligious. He's not talking about the moral reprobates. He's not talking about, as we might call them, the heathens. He's not talking about those who believe in false gods and goddesses. He's talking about those who, at least in word, will treat him as Lord. They will call him Lord. But not everyone who says the right things about Jesus is going to enter the kingdom of heaven. I don't know any more clear statement about faith-only salvation than this. People say, yes, I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, therefore I am saved. I have called upon Jesus as Lord, therefore I am saved. Jesus said, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who what?
Does the will of my Father.
Does the will of the Father. I mean, there could not be a clearer statement about the biblical nature of saving faith. The faith that saves is the faith that does. I mean, that's what Jesus says here. There's just no clearer statement. He who does the will of the Father. And again, the danger is being self-deluded, because there are even those who do things that are not going to be accepted by the Lord. Didn't we do religiously? Didn't we do church? Didn't we do religion? Weren't we good people? Prophesy in your name, cast out demons, perform many miracles. We would consider those to be amazing things. What's the issue that Jesus says there is with those things that they supposedly did in his name? What was the problem with those things?
Practicing lawlessness.
Lawlessness. The King James uses the word iniquity there, but literally the word there is without law or no law. We would say outside of law. And the only way to describe that, at least in my mind, is to imagine law as a sphere, and everything within that is abiding by the law. And Jesus says you've gone outside of law. You've operated outside the bounds of the law. That's lawlessness. They've acted as if there is no law. That's the idea. And we would describe that as operating without God's authority, without God's approval. And so this is a powerful statement about the matter of the importance of what we would say Bible authority, or as we've been saying on Sunday mornings, God's authority. And operating within the bounds of what he has permitted or authorized. And Jesus then goes on to illustrate that principle. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them or acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. So you have contrast here between the wise and the foolish. Is the difference between the wise and the foolish what they knew? Is that the difference between the wise and the foolish man? What they heard? No, they had the same information. Is the difference between the wise and the foolish the fact that they built, the fact that they did something? No. Did one of them face greater opposing forces, greater threat than the other? No. The same rain, floods, and wind are described in both. What's the difference between the two builders? It's the foundation. Luke's account of this metaphor, Luke's account says that the wise man dug deep. I love that picture. He dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock. And the foolish man built his house without any foundation. And so Jesus says the wise man who digs deep and builds on a solid foundation is the one who acts on the information that he has. The foolish man takes that information in one ear and out the other. He does nothing with it. And so there is no more vivid picture I can imagine with which to describe spiritual wisdom and spiritual foolishness. When Jesus finished his teaching, the crowds were amazed because he taught as one having authority and not as their scribes. Jesus' teaching was unique and different. He spoke in a very powerful way, in a way that they weren't used to hearing. You've heard that it was said, but I say to you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will the warning about the warnings about sincerity and action, the emphasis upon doing rather than just being content to be, not just to be a Jew, but to live like a child of God. There's some remarkable contrasts that Jesus draws in the sermon. All right, we've got a couple of minutes left tonight, so I'm going to stop talking and question, comment, input at all about what we've talked about tonight, or back to some other part of the Sermon on the Mount. Anybody have anything they want to add to the discussion? Okay, well, what we are going to do next is we are going to do New Testament epistle surveys. We're just going to take one letter at a time and just kind of touch the high points, give a little context and brief ourselves on the epistles. We're not going to dig deeply into them. Well, we might dig a little deeper into 3rd John and Jude than the others, but we're not going to dig deeply into any of them, but just try to get a sense of them so that we are more comfortable with the New Testament epistles. So we're just going to take one each week, and for simplicity's sake, we're just going to start with Romans. We know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the Gospels and tell us about Jesus. We know Acts is a book of history. And so we're just going to start with the book of Romans, and we're just going to take one at a time and take a snapshot of it. So we'll start that, Lord willing, next Wednesday night. We are going to continue on Sunday nights with this series of Some Men Say, but what does the Bible teach? And we will... the next few studies on Sunday nights, we're going to talk about some things specifically on the subject of baptism. So I hope you'll make plans to continue to participate in these studies. There's nothing else. Y'all have a great rest of the week. Lord willing, we will see you at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Night.